All right, for these notes, we're going to be on page 4 in Unit 7. You should have already glued this page into your journal. At the top it says prokaryotic cells, and at the bottom it says eukaryotic cells. We're going to talk about the differences between these two types of cells and fill in these notes as well as this chart that compares them, and then even label a few parts on each cell. In the video that you just watched with Bill Nye, he talked about how all living things are made up of cells. They are teeny tiny little building blocks of life. You yourself are made up of billions or trillions of cells, so we're talking really small. We can only see these cells with a microscope. Cells can be divided into two types, and that's where these words come in, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So we're going to start at the top where it says prokaryotic cells. Okay, and we're going to fill in some of these notes. The word prokaryotic is probably a word that we've never heard before, but if we break it down to the root words, pro means before, and kary means nucleus. Now we'll talk more about a nucleus over the next few weeks, but a nucleus is just a part of a cell. It's kind of the central part, almost like the brain of the cell. It does a lot of the controlling. So prokaryotic, if that means before a nucleus, these cells do not have a nucleus. One thing that is important about a nucleus is that in some cells, that's where the DNA is. DNA is basically the instructions for the organism. That's what's unique about you. It's what makes you you, what color your hair you have, what color eyes you have, and all of the different processes that happen in your cells are controlled by DNA. Now, since prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus, their DNA kind of just floats around through the cell. It doesn't stay in one specific location. So we're going to say that there is circular, because that's the shape of it, circular DNA that floats freely in the cell. If you look over to the cell on the right, this is a diagram of a prokaryotic cell, and all of that kind of squiggly lines in the middle, that is the DNA, and that's what we mean by it being circular in shape and floating freely in the cell. It's not contained in one spot. There are also no other organelles or little parts of a cell. Okay, the prokaryotic cell is very simple, you will see, compared to the eukaryotic cell. So we have no membrane-bound organelles. That just means that there aren't a lot of other small parts in the prokaryotic cell. When it comes to size, partially because these are so simple, there are not a lot of parts, they're typically smaller than the other type of cell. And now remember, when we're talking size, we're saying that these are still very teeny tiny, and we can only see cells with a microscope. Most prokaryotic cells form organisms or living things that can be as small as just one cell. So sometimes we call those organisms unicellular. Uni, that prefix, means one. Think about a unicycle, right? It's like a bicycle, but only one wheel. This last sentence here is stuff that we'll talk more about again later, but it talks about, do these organisms need oxygen to survive or not? And some of the organisms that are made up of prokaryotic cells can do both. They can be aerobic, where they need oxygen, or they can be anaerobic, meaning that they could live without oxygen. And we'll talk more about that over the next few weeks. If we look at the rest of this diagram here, we've already labeled the DNA as the squiggly lines inside. The rest of this space inside is filled up with something called the cytoplasm. And that's almost like a jello-like texture, and it just fills the inside of the cell. Cytoplasm. We said that it doesn't have a lot of organelles or small parts, but what it does have are these teeny little tiny dots, which are called ribosomes. We'll talk more about what those do later, but you can label it here. And then it looks like a lot of the prokaryotic cells have a tail. Okay, it looks kind of like a tail structure here. This is actually called the flagella, and that's what helps the cell move. Remember, some organisms may just be one cell, and they'll need a way to move. So if we were to summarize some of this information, I'm going to move down to the middle chart. If we're talking just about the prokaryotic cells, we would say that they are usually unicellular, meaning the organism can be made of just one cell. The size of the cells, usually when we talk about size, we measure things in centimeters or even smaller millimeters. We can get even smaller than that with something called a micrometer. And the size of these cells is usually between 1 and 10 micrometers. So again, we're talking about something that we cannot see with our eyes. We'd have to have a microscope. Nucleus, we don't have one. No nucleus. The shape of the DNA, or the structure, we called that circular, even though it looks like squiggly lines up there in our picture. And remember that it doesn't have a specific location. It doesn't have a nucleus to stay in. So the location of the DNA is floating in the cytoplasm. And that last box about reproduction, we're not going to worry about the different methods of reproduction right now. So make sure you have the prokaryotic cells part of your notes complete, and then you'll see the next video to complete the eukaryotic cells section of these notes.